Now, there's lots of things out there in the marketplace that we can kind of dive into on a granular level, and that's going to give us the ability to look into the future. I always call it the crystal ball, essentially. Now, right now we kind of see a lot of markets in their lull phase, which I always say gives infinite potential. Right? When you find a bottom of some sort, there's always nowhere else to go but up. And so, one thing that we want to talk about is what markets might be more exposed to potential uplift, right? Nobody wants to talk about depressed markets anymore. That's, last year's news, right? 2026 has strong potential for an upside market. The reason being is that we're going to have a new Fed chair that's going to be announced. So we should expect interest rates to drop somewhere around, pretty soon. I would have to say maybe in Q1, possibly early Q2. Once that Fed chair is announced, the first initial reaction is predicted to be interest rate cuts. Now, what that'll do to the housing markets, is anybody's guess. There's a lot of inventory out there, so you could see prices drop initially, but over time, we would expect for that market to improve, construction to improve. We really are geared up for the potential setting of a demand increase. Now, one thing we want to also talk about is the exposure to electrification. Now, I love talking about electrification. Well, electrification to me means technology, right? Technology is going to require power, lots of it. And so now we have all these databases. We're using AI. AI is computing at billions of parameters per second, which is quite interesting. And so the new AI is going to require tons of electricity. And everywhere that they're installed, everybody has to talk about, well, what's the infrastructure going to do? Is that going to take away water? Is that going to take away power? Is that going to take away things that we need? And so that's where chemicals are going to come in handy, right? We have lots of chemicals that are heavily used in that energy sector, right? We call them exposure to electrification. And I love electrification. So I'm going to be talking about those products that are exposed to electrification today. So let's dive on in. Now, the first product I want to talk about is going to be ABS. It's part of our engineering thermoplastics, one of our best publications that we have, because we really talk about and we lay out a lot of those products that are going to be used for electrification and thermal molding. Okay. Now, ABS is actually not linked to electrification. Always got to throw that curveball out there, right? But ABS is going to be one of those chemicals that are going to be the structurally sound one, right? I would call it kind of the foundation of what's happening in the chemical industry. It really looks after what's going on in the automotive sector, some construction uplift. ABS has a very strong potential there, but it's also going to be heavily affected by how feedstocks are reacting, right? And so the good news that has happened on the ABS side of things is that we've seen a falling of the feedstock prices. So margins are improving on the ABS sector, especially in North America. And so we've seen these prices kind of increasing steadily, even though, production, nothing has really changed, maybe a little bit of protectionism with the tariff situation going on. But for the most part, ABS seems to be on a steady incline. What is that telling us? That is telling us that the demand base is there. That's why we're looking at it. That demand base is there. Sure, automotive, everybody would love a much better year, right? Of course. But I think for the most part, the way that the automotive sector and the construction sector are looking is looking upward. And so ABS, great fundamental product to be looking at, just to be studying, see how things are going. And as you can see with these North American prices that we're expecting an upward lifting market. No guarantees there, but that's kind of the gearing up. We're stabilizing, looking, I would have to say probably looking upward. Now let's start talking about the products that are more affected by what's going on the electrification process. So let's talk about PBT for a second, okay? One of the many uses, many demands of PBT is going to be on electrical components, motor components, and sensors, right? And so this has a element of electrification demand, right? And we are going to see that like slight uplift depending on how demand reacts, especially in the automotive sector. So those motor sensors, motor components, electric connectors all have a PBT element to it. So we are going to, we do predict, we do in our forecasting that we're going to see some uplifting. Even our worst case scenario, we should see some uplifting by the end of 2026. So on PBT, on one of those electrification chemicals, the result is expecting to have some stabilization at the early of 26 with uplifting momentum in 20 by the end of the year. Now let's talk about another one, polycarbonate. Now, polycarbonate has a main use for battery enclosures, essentially, which is huge in a lot of applications, not just automotive. Right nowadays, battery backups are becoming a standard. Right, I have thousands of battery backups. I even have solar panels on my house that has battery backup, and that polycarbonate is going to be the housing of the battery components. There's flame retardant grades, which are going to help add for protection against the housing of the electricity. So polycarbonate is one of those really heavily exposed electrification demand sectors. And so as you can see in our demand forecasting for PC, we have a lot better uplift potential, right? Now, granted, let's say things don't pick up in 26, doom and gloom continues in the marketplace. We could see that market continually, steadily moving downward. However, I do believe that electrification is going to continue. We'll probably see a very stable 26 for PC with a substantial amount of uplift potential on the forecasting side. The next product we're going to talk about is going to be the polyamide resin sector. Now, again, we can talk about the demand lull that we kind of entered into 2026, but another heavily automobile sector polyamide resin demand, but again, really pushed on that electrification. So another potential market that could see some upside depending on how that electrification kind of plays out. So three products that we feel are going to have a strong tie to electrification. And as that continues to move forward, we're going to study and monitor those demands as well as how the margins are improving. Right, right now we're in a pretty good period for those that are in the midstream sector because our feedstock costs have continually moved downward, and so we're kind of reaching a sweet spot for some products that we're not going to see that product moving downward, and so some room has started to develop. We kind of covered that last month on the UPR sector, PET as well. But this is starting to happen for a lot of products, and this is good for those midstream activities, right? Raw chemical producers probably aren't so happy. They will have to review how their margins are performing. Might cause some downward sliding of production, especially domestically. But in the end, we should see margins return with those downward feedstock movements. All right, last but not least, we're going to switch to our ChemEdge platform. ChemEdge studies propylene glycol very well, probably one of the leading analysis of propylene glycol in the United States. So please contact us if you have any interest in learning more about what we see, how we see the propylene glycol movements going. Now, like I mentioned last week, we saw propylene in the United States, both contract and spot price, both reaching kind of a low turn. And so propylene glycol, it has become one of those, it's a stable product, right? But that bottom has fallen out for it. So propylene glycol is turning into a pretty good product to be a chemical producer of propylene glycol, as well as being in those midstream activities, which we've seen that with the data center demand additions, which come with a lot of stipulations, right? That coolant has to work properly. And so, it's not submersion technology. This is going to go in the HVAC systems. That propylene glycol has to be able to adequately cool those data centers, right? And so there's lots of provisions, lots of risk involved because, those data centers are going to require you to cover the insurance essentially for the hardware that's in those data centers, which I can only imagine is astronomical, but also the data that's in there as well. So lots of risk associated with the data center propylene glycol, but it is one of the hot topics in North America is that propylene glycol that's going to be used in the data centers. So we have seen the propylene glycol similar to all the other products kind of reaching a bottom, so to speak, at the end of 2025. But our forecasting, our viewpoint of propylene glycol is that it should have that upward looking view again. And it's another product that a lot of folks are becoming interested in North American production is not going to cover all of North American demand. So imports are going to be needed, and thus trade is going to be quite active in North America. So again, I'm grateful for everybody joining me today. Just happy to do this once a week. And so should be publishing every Tuesday. So look out, and we'll be going over ResourceWise data to really give you guys some good viewpoints of what's happening in your markets. I look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.